Hey everybody, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast here with my Grandmaster game of the Alekhine's Defense 4 Pawns variation. This game took place between Velimirovic, playing white, ranked 2515 at the time, and Kovacevic as black, ranked 2500 in Yugoslavia in 1979. So let's get started. White opens up with pawn to e4, and we very quickly get into the standard book moves for the Alekhine's Defense. The 4 pawn variation here. The exchange on e5, and you'll notice that white has a strong center, which black is going to start to undermine with its minor pieces. In fact, we have pretty standard book moves from the last video all the way up to this position. So from here, you'll remember that in this position, black has two options. Black can play either the queen to d7 or the bishop to e7, with the next move being castling on that side. In this position, black plays bishop to e7, which is signaling that it is definitely going to be trying to castle on the king side. And in this position, white, in response, usually develops its own bishop to e2, which is preparing to castle itself on the king side. But here, white decided to push the center with pawn to d5. And you'll notice that after the exchange, white has connected center pawns, which is a pretty good position to have. So play continues as follows, with black saving the knight and putting it to b4, which is getting ready to land a fork on c2. To prevent that, white plays knight to d4. This was also attacking the unprotected bishop here on f5. So black saves the bishop by pulling it to d7. From here, white plays queen to f3. Again, what white is not doing is developing its bishop here on f1 to e2. It's not getting ready to castle kingside. I think maybe that would have been a bit better. Perhaps what white was trying to do was reserve the option for castling on the queen side at some points. But yeah, I think actually if you go back in this position, it just would have been more solid and more safe to develop the bishop to e2. Instead, what we have is the queen to f3. And play continues as follows, with a white playing pawn to c5. Black playing pawn to c5. White captures en passant, and here black makes a small positional mistake and decides to capture with the pawn. I think a better move in this position would have been maybe for the knight to capture on c6, and after you have the exchange on c6, white can play the bishop up to b5, and after the exchange of bishops on b5, this is a very, very equal position, almost dead equal. Whereas if we go back here, after black captures the pawn with the b pawn, unfortunately, you'll notice that black has weakened its queenside pawn structure a little bit. It has an isolated pawn on the c file and an isolated pawn on the a file, and has given white a bit of a positional advantage. However, white lost that positional advantage on the next move. Again, instead of simply developing the bishop to e2 and getting ready to castle, white plays pawn to e6. From here we have black capturing the pawn with his own pawn, and white plays pawn to a3 to try to kick the knight off of the square that it's on, and black simply pulls the knight back to d5. Now, when I was looking at this position, what white played finally is developing its bishop to d3. However, if we go back here, looking at this position, I thought two things. One, why not capture the knight here on d5 with the knight on c3? And two, why not try to save the bishop on e3? So the answer to the first question is pretty simple, because if white captures the knight with its own knight, then black is able to get connected passed pawns in the center of the board, which is obviously not good for white. In answer to the second question, in this position, if white tries to save the bishop and maybe play something like perhaps bishop to b2, bishop to d2, well, from here, black is actually able to gain a couple of tempos by pushing the white knight around. From here, black can play the bishop to f6, White can attack that bishop with its knight to e4, but black is able to ignore that and castle. And after white captures the bishop, checking the king, black can recapture. And what you'll notice here is that black has a far superior position. First of all, white has this knight on the rim of the board, and as the saying goes, knights on the rim are grim. They don't impact a lot of squares in the center. White has already given up a couple of tempos to get this knight to the rim of the board, whereas black has completed its development. White has not completed its development, still has to develop this bishop on f1, still has to castle, and currently the white side is going to have to give up yet another tempo to save the queen, which is under attack on f3. So I think that is why in this position, if we go back, that is why I think in this position, white simply played bishop to d3 and decided to concede the bishop pair, which must have really hurt, because after the knight captures on e3 and the queen recaptures on e3, you'll notice that the board is very open and black still has its bishop pair, whereas white was forced to concede its. So in this position, black takes the opportunity and castles. White plays the queen to e4, which is getting an attack ready on the pawn here on h7. So to dampen that attack, we have pawn to g6. And here, white makes a big blunder. White plays pawn to h4. Now, I'm pretty sure that what white was thinking was pushing this pawn to h5 and trying to weaken the kingside pawn structure even further. However, this move is a blunder because what it allows is for for black to swing the initiative over to its side. First, let me show you what the computer would have preferred in this position. After we have pawn to g6, what the computer liked was knight captures on e6, and then after the bishop captures, you have white is able to get rid of black's bishop pair and hit the king with a check. The king can go over into the corner to h8. White can castle long. Black can play knight to d5. White can play the knight to e2, which is trying to prevent the knight from capturing here. If white captures the knight on d5, after the pawn recaptures, then you have this open diagonal with the king and the rook. With the queen and the rook from black bearing down on it, or they will be very shortly. That's not good. And alternatively, if I think white allows the knight on d5 to capture on c3, then the pawn is forced to recapture, and that is going to further weaken the pawn structure on the queen side here. So instead, white simply saves the knight and plays it to e2. Black can play rook to f2. You have king over to b1, the rook capturing on g2, and rook on d over to f1. And this is about a half-point advantage for black in this position. For white in this position. So this is what the computer preferred to. Let me go back here. The move that white actually played in the game, which was h4. And as I said, this move, unfortunately for white, allowed black to gain a lot of the initiative. From here, what we have is pawn to e5, and here in the game, white simply saves the knight by playing its f3. Real quick, if you might be thinking that white can simply grab this pawn since it's unprotected, and if you'll notice, white is currently down a pawn, so it might want to capture one of black's center pawns, or black's only center pawn. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out like that, because after you have the queen capturing on e5, you have the bishop capturing the pawn on h4 with check, and there's no time for the rook to capture this bishop, because if it does, black's rook is going to swing over to the e file and pin the queen down to the king, and that's going to be a lost game. So from here, you can have the king pulling over to d1, and then the bishop back to f6, attacking the queen, and you'll notice that white is still down a pawn in this position. So instead, in the game, after black pushes the pawn to e5, you have knight to f3. From here, white plays bishop to f5, which is attacking the queen. Now, instead of immediately reacting to the threat against the queen, white decides to throw in a check with the bishop. Black simply moves the king over to g7, And from here, white pulls the queen down to e2, where you will notice it is still keeping an eye on this c4 rook because it is under attack from this knight. You have the exchange on c4, and from here you have queen to b6. Now, I think facing this position, white probably thought that it really needed to get its king out of the center of the board. However, unfortunately, with the queen sitting here on b6, it is not able to castle kingside, so what white decided to do was castle queenside. However, I'm not quite sure that this was really necessarily an objectively good move because you have this semi-open file leading into the king's castle position. One of these rooks is going to be supporting the queen very shortly here. You have this bishop sitting here on f5, which is carving a diagonal into white's castle position. I think in this position, white simply had the unfortunate decision of making the least bad move in this position. Not quite Zubsang, but yeah, definitely not the strongest move that white could have been able to play. So after white castles on the queen side, you have the rook on a moving over to b8, which, as I said, is backing up the queen along the b file. To defend against the checkmate, white is forced to play rook to d2. And then from here, you have the bishop swinging in and capturing the pawn on a3. Now, if white plays something really stupid like captures the pawn, captures with the pawn, then you're going to have checkmate right here, and that's game over. Obviously, white was too smart for that, and instead played the king over to d1. From here, you have the queen hitting the check on b3 and forcing the queen exchange. And after you have the exchange on b3, white captures the bishop with its pawn, and black captures the knight. White captures the pawn on e5, but black captures the pawn on a3. And you'll notice that pretty much no matter what white does in this position, black is still going to be up 2 pawns. From here, you have white moving its rook over to e1. Black moves its rook over to e8 to try to challenge the rook's control of the e file. White doubles up the rook on the e file, but then black simply hits a check with its rook. Now, if white tries to block the check by moving its rook back to d1, what this is going to do is allow black to get the rooks off the table, and in this position, you'll notice that black has 2 passed pawns, and this is going to be a pretty one-end game for black. So that's why instead of trying to block with the rook facing this position, white simply pulls the king over to c1. But after bishop to b3, white resigns, because the only way to defend against the checkmate, if the rook is able to get to b1, that would be checkmate. And the only way to defend against that is to play rook to c2, after which black loses the rook and subsequently the game. So again, that's why in this position on after move 33 from black, white resigns. So yeah, so that's the Alekhine's Defense 4 Pawns variation at the Grandmaster Play. I hope you got something out of this and the last video. Definitely be sure to check out my videos that I hope to have coming out soon on the exchange and the modern variations and the Alekhine's Defense, as well as other videos in other openings and defenses for both sides. So yeah, take care. Questions and comments are certainly welcome. And yeah, take care. Bye.